Artist and academic Shukla Sawant completed her BFA and MFA from College of Art, studied printmaking at École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris and was Commonwealth Scholar at the Slade School of Art, London. Her areas of research and practice include South Asian modernism, contemporary art movements, photography and printmaking. She has had 10 solos including at Delhi Shilpi Chakra, Harriet Green Gallery London, Anand Art Gallery and Lakreen in Mumbai. She was the founder member of Indian Printmakers Guild and the working group member of Khoj International Artists Association. Hello and welcome to Chaibrary. Today we have with us artist and academic Shukla Sawant. Shukla, a very warm welcome to Chaibrary.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm absolutely delighted that the Chaibrary team is keeping alive the memory of J.J. Rodia ji in such a wonderful way.
So, Shukla, you are a professor in School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU, and you're also a founding member of starting of the school, I believe. So, how it started, based on what construct at that time, this particular department, what were your thoughts, and how do you see it going forward in the light of the new movements and everything?
Well, to just understand where the School of Arts and Aesthetics comes from, we also have to understand the institutional landscape of India, the art institutional landscape. And if you look back, we know that most art schools were initiated in the 19th century as a part of the whole colonial project. The Delhi College of Art was one such last school. So if you just look at Delhi, the College of Art is something that was founded in the 1940s. But prior to that, you also had the Sharada Vakil School, which was initiated by one of the students of Abanindranath Tagore. And then you also had, of course, Jamia Millia Islamia, which did not have a full-fledged bachelor's and master's program, but which came out of the Nai Talim movement of, that was initiated by Gandhi and, of course, Devi Prasad ji, etc., who went to teach in Wardha. Now, in 2001, starting an art school was also something that gave us time to reflect on what had happened in the past. The MS University Baroda is the first post-independence initiative. It is something that comes from a very complex network of ideas about art practice and art making. Some of it comes from the Barnes Foundation, which was really something that was set up by artists who had left Europe and had gone as a result of the closing down of the Bauhaus School to Philadelphia, which is where Markand Bhatt had studied. And Hansa Mehta, who was a woman and a vice chancellor of the MS University Baroda, brought together a very interesting group of people to initiate that university. This is from the 1950s, right? So now you're talking about 2001, and you'd already had in the 1980s a series of exhibitions that dismantled the construct of the art school. One of them being Jyotirndra Jain's Other Masters, which is looking at different perceptual systems through which art practices were produced. And you also had the Magician de la Terre exhibition in France, which was in 1989, if I'm not mistaken. So that also made us realize that a vast body of work that's produced using the visual language is not the result of people who trained in art schools. Along with that, you also had traditional forms of knowledge transfer. You had familial conditions of art practice that had continued. There were a vast number of practitioners in rural areas that had no contact whatsoever with colonial systems of knowledge. But at the same time, you also had television, you also had the print media, etc., that was familiarizing people with different kinds of art practices from across the world. So in 2001, it was very clear to us that a studio-based program was something perhaps not necessary, but a theoretical program. And if practice had to be brought in, it had to be brought in the form of research. And the initial faculty that was brought in, Dr. Jyotirndra Jain, Dr. Kavita Singh, we were from visual studies. We had two theatre practitioners and theoreticians, Shiva Prakash from Karnataka and Vishnu Priya Dutt from Calcutta. They were both at that time in Delhi. When they decided to start this school, we applied and we were just lucky to be chosen together, and we started the school. There had been an attempt earlier to start it, something like 30 years ago in the 1970s, I think, in which Lotika Vardhanji, etc., had been appointed, but that didn't take off, right? That school didn't take off. So for us, it was a new beginning. We were given adequate time to formulate courses. And sometime down the line, we realized that one of the essential components of visual practice is cinema. And so that was something we felt was important to add as well. And some 5 years down the line, we also then initiated a cinema studies program. But the MA is interdisciplinary, also because I think this kind of compartmentalization of disciplines that had happened in the art school context was also
You wanted to break away from that?
modernist phenomena. To see something as a pure sculptural practice or a pure painting practice or a pure printmaking practice, right? This kind of departmentalization was a result of a kind of a taxonomy of art, that this is that, it's fixed. So we kind of wanted to question that, and that's why the MA program is interdisciplinary.
Okay. And in a way, actually, it is kind of, isn't it kind of going back to our Indian aesthetic where everything of bhavras, everything is explained and in the context of the arts, and the arts are part of it. So was that also a conscious part of it, or it was more from what angle you were saying? Like, was there any Indian context to it, traditional Indian aesthetic that we talk about?
So let us look at it this way. To define something in essentialist terms as Indian is problematic, because we've had cross-cultural connections across the world for centuries, right? People on the west coast of India have had ties with Africa. They've had ties with, I think, far more than they've had even with the east coast of India. So that, in some sense, looking at an arts program through that lens was not our concern. But the fact is that we are located in a political entity called India today. And understanding the Indic sphere became important for us, also because if you look at most art programs, especially the way art history has been taught, there's so much emphasis on Western art history that we fail to look at other areas where we've had connections with the world. Whether it is the Far East, whether it is the Arab world, whether it is Africa, we've had cultural contacts with worlds across the seas for centuries. So the location was India. Certainly, most of the courses dealt, at least in art history, with the Indic sphere, because I don't think it was really possible to teach a world art or run a world art program, because certainly research methodology is something that develops out of a lot of European art context because of the way art history as a discipline developed. But it was for us to locate ourselves here and look at the broader understandings of art.
Okay. So what happens to when you have a holistic program like this, which is definitely makes sense and very logical? What happens to the deeper inquiry into some specific because right now it is of age of niche specialization. We are looking at digital art, we are looking at NFT as one of the currencies, and with so many things, new things happening. So how do we equip our students on those things, or how do you intend to do that? Because there are those little more deeper into technology probably, or into further things that were not part of the curriculum before. How do you integrate those things into when you do a holistic thing like this?
So one of the things about JNU is that we have regular revisions of curriculum, because we have board of studies, and that kind of ensures that
it's updated.
Yeah, it's updated, but more importantly, students participate in decision making.
What they do?
You have the students' faculty meetings, you have participation in the board of studies with student representatives, etc. And I think one of the most important things is to understand the students' body that comes to JNU. Because for the longest time, JNU had a deprivation point system. So long before, reservations became a kind of a issue to be, a policy to be implemented in universities, we had already done it. And that's, I think, the transformative aspect of even us as teachers in a university. Because we are constantly questioned, our understanding of art is also something that is, pointed towards if it is not inclusive of many different opinions. And so even the curriculum that we develop has constantly changed. I have 2 PhD students who are working on precisely that, NFTs and the politics of digital art, as well as video. So these are 2 of my current PhD students.
Wow, that's great. That's great. So you have substantial contribution to the historical perspectives that you've researched on art pedagogy of the country, post-colonial and post-colonial. And there is so much of discussion that is happening on caste and gender and double marginalization and all that. So how does one balance that when you're, you're into, since we are talking about institution building and you're welcoming all kinds of diverse perspective, yet you're running an institution. So what has been your experience of how do you balance the whole thing? How you navigate this thing?
So this is the thing, it's not yet. It is because of that we run the institution the way we do. because
Okay.
it's integral to the way we practice art history. It is integral to the way we understand art history. And a lot of the questioning that is happening from communities that have been marginalized. Art histories are being questioned. The canon is being questioned. What is in the museums is being questioned. And much of what is being addressed today is through this process of questioning, right? And I think, if you look at even the new universities that have come up, whether it's the Ambedkar University or whether it's some of these private universities that are running art,
They're on this
informed art
premise now.
courses, there's a completely different kind of a student body that's coming. And they are producing some magnificent work, right? And so to theorize that, to write about that, you also need scholars,
Yeah.
who have a nuanced understanding of the social world and its complexity.
So coming a little bit from the academic background and then being in the market, I do feel very sadly that there is a disconnect between, there's so much of work going on in the academia and there's so much of progressive dialogues happening in the academia. Why do you think that the market has the art market has failed to implement that? What is it, according to you, is the cause and the remedy of what we can do?
See, the market is something that operates very differently. It is recognized as one of those institutions of art that create a canon. You have art history, which is one of the institutions. You have, the museum, which is one of the institutions, one of the components of, recognizing something as art or significant art. Now, the gallery system was something that was introduced in the late 19th, early 20th century. We also have to understand the politics of how the gallery system came into being. Many have
Just
said
let us
that.
know about what is the.
Yeah, so basically, you have in the 19th century in France the salon system,
Right.
which allowed the public to come and judge on its own. That when paintings are placed side to side, side by side, and the public has access to it, and you have print journalism that emerges with art criticism as a separate field, then you can make judgment. The jury is one form of judgment, but the public judges you too.
Right,
Right?
right.
And so, in fact, Ravi Verma, it's very interesting for me that before his paintings that were commissioned by the Maharaja of Baroda
Right.
went to Baroda, he actually held an exhibition of his paintings in the Pune town hall.
Okay.
So it was open to scrutiny to the public.
Okay, so it was like emulating what's happening in the West that way, like he wanted it to be.
But that the fact that he even thought that it is something that should be judged by the public or
Okay.
viewed by the public, right? It was a private commission. So this is a 19th century phenomenon in India as well, where so many of these art societies come, and so then that phenomenon leads to the formation of art galleries. There is evidence of art galleries coming up in the late 19th century as well. I have evidence, archival evidence of that, right? So this discourse wasn't necessarily happening only in the English language press. We have a wide range of journals and magazines, print publications from the late 19th century onwards, where art criticism becomes important. Judging artworks becomes important. I can give you an instance, for example, from the 1920s, when in the Marathi press, for instance, there was a back and forth between art critics and artists about the relevance of the female nude. So the whole Kenneth Clark thing about the naked and the nude is actually being discussed here much earlier.
Okay.
Right? We were talking earlier about the idea of titled and untitled work. There is in the 1930s a discussion in the Bengali circuits of art about what is the meaning of a title of a work of art.
How interesting. We think it is today's contemporary discussion that we are doing, right?
And these are happening. There are so many discussions happening in multiple different language spheres that unfortunately that 10% that speaks English has ignored.
Ignored it.
And so my research really is looking at the more granular world of art practice and art making.
So since you mentioned Marathi literature and you mentioned, so your research draws a lot of material from the regional language, Marathi language, and that brings a lot of necessary nuance to the historical perspective, right? And majority of our teachings have been in English to English speaking population for art and art history. So is the gap, how far is the gap now? How much do we know about the regional language literature of art criticism that had been going on, and because we don't have access to, the research has not happened? Or where are we right now? Because I remember reading nothing about other than English journals or discussions, not hardly anything about it. We were not taught, I would say.
So what has happened interestingly is that because in Bengal, a very rich print culture developed fairly early, the scholars like Tapati Guha Thakurta or Partha Mitra have actually done all their research based on Bengali language sources.
schools. So that has happened.
That has happened, but it hasn't happened elsewhere as
So,
much
like
as
for
it
example,
should.
South, which would have their own discourses, I'm sure.
But there are many young scholars who are now understanding the importance of this, material that's there that reflects on how art practices were unfolding in India, and it's important to kind of now theorize using this material, right? And I'm not discrediting the English language material or what was happening in that space, because that's also extremely significant. And there were many journals, in English, no dearth of them. Triveni journal that came out from down south. You had Modern Review, which was, the English version of Prabhashi, which was the Bengali previous thing. But in Marathi, I can reel off names to you: Ratnakar and Dhruv and Vasundhara. There was so Anjali. I mean, I can just reel off these names to you, in which people, like a lot of people were writing.
And they were writing about modern art, I mean, the art of the time, and everything about the Western and Indian, everything. Or they were writing about local artists.
So this is the thing, that we need to understand that the art world was extremely complex, because once print culture opens you up to art worlds from around the world, you're obviously going to be speaking in relation to art practices from around the world. If you look at Modern Review, it wasn't just covering the Bengal school artists, it was also covering artists from Japan, it was also covering
So it was a very updated dialogue happening. It was.
I won't say updated, because a lot of the really contemporary developments were things that people were not familiar with, but at least they were willing to challenge for it, or sometimes even succumb to the colonial discourse of art, right? There are interesting things. I remember there's a very interesting short story called The Block, which is a critique of the still life.
Okay.
Right? And it's in Marathi called Thoklayarchi Chitra.
Okay.
Which means the drawing of a block. So, it's a critique of the whole still life form of learning how to draw.
Right.
Right? And so there are all these kind of really interesting critiques that are happening, and there is also challenges to modernism. There's a very interesting art critic called Madhav Rao Bagal, who's from GG School of Art, but went on to become a trade union leader, and he was involved with the peasant movements, etc. And he was a regular art critic. And he has, and because he came from a socialist perspective, he had a very negative opinion about abstraction and modernism.
Cut to today's situation, how is that? Because one of the things that people say is that there's a death of art criticism in the mainstream media, in the world of paid advertorials. It is all about not art criticism, probably eulogy of art, and I think we have all been a part and parcel of this. And there is no independent art critics writing on a public domain, not enough to educate public about it. So again, going back to the question of how does public know about these discourses and also get educated and learn to appreciate. The general feeling is it's gone down drastically. Is that true? What is your opinion? The art criticism, pure art criticism, for criticism's sake.
So, art criticism was largely anonymous, because the power of anonymity
How was it anonymous? Wasn't there writers?
No, the name was never carried, right? Okay. The belief was that the critic actually had to be anonymous and had the capacity to judge, right? Quite often, a lot of the criticism was anonymous. I can also give you an instance. There's a very interesting description of the Bombay Progressives, in which a critic who reveals his identity in the 1970s says that we would often create controversies just to generate interest around the exhibitions of the Bombay Progressives.
They could do that because it's anonymous.
No, they would write letters to newspapers back and forth. They would write the letter, they would write the response as well.
Wow.
Right? Okay. So that was one of the strategies that they employed because they found academic art boring, and they found what the progressives were doing.
And that's what they're doing strategically to push the discussion forward.
Right? Now, this is happening. It's not that it's not happening. If you look at the social media space,
right.
It's happening. And never underestimate the power of the pen and the keyboard. I say that to everybody. I say that to my students. I say that to anybody who has a critical voice. Do not underestimate the power of the keyboard and the pen.
What do you mean by that?
That, if you are finding something problematic, and if you think that there is some criticism that needs to be expressed, then you should use you have your Facebook post, you have this thing. Then this is something that I think we need to understand, that the newspaper space today, or the television channel space. Most
Totally,
of it is
as
now,
paid
sponsored space.
Sponsored spaces, yes.
You're not going to get genuine criticism. And if you really want the art world to grow, if you want the world to really remain critical in order to grow,
Yes.
then you have to understand that criticism is necessary.
Very interesting. I want to quickly come back to you as an artist before we again go back to the other parts. You have been practicing in multidisciplinary platforms of printmaking, and you have also done installations. So I would like to talk about this very interesting exhibition of Remembering Panditas, who give an insight into that and give an insight into what are your queries, inquiries that you're looking at in your art practice, and not the research just, but the art practice.
So I, as you know, trained in studio practice. My entire undergraduate studies and my MA degree is in studio practice before I moved on to an MA in theory, art theory as well, from the Slade School,
So
and did my PhD later.
You did printmaking as a specialization?
I had it as an option because Anupam Sood was, but I had painting as my specialization for the masters. But later I did printmaking along with theory. They used to run a very interesting program at the Slade School that allowed practice and theory side by side. So it was different from the MFA program. And I had the fortune to have amazing scholars. Jean Fisher, who was one of the editors of the Third Text, which is a very important journal that started in the 1980s. She was one of our tutors. And so for me, we also have to understand a little bit about the transformation in the art schools from the 1950s onwards. Because this is when the MFA programs start, where theoretical understanding of what you're doing, or at least some kind of a theoretical discourse around art, it's important to understand where this is coming from, right? It starts in the 1950s, starts in Baroda. College of Art has massive agitations in the 1970s, which then leads to the starting of the BFA, MFA programs with art history.
Before that, there were no MFA program anywhere?
No, no. So art history becomes a very important component of teaching. Unfortunately, College of Art did not have that, do it as much as it should have. That's unfortunately, but it's true of all other programs that started. And for me, that meant that even my own art practice transformed. I was reading a lot more. I was reading philosophy of art. I was reading this thing, and that obviously brought a shift in my own art practice. I had, if you look at the kind of work that you do as Indian printmakers, the Indian Printmakers Guild, most of the literature that we produce was largely about...
one of the founding member of Indian Printmakers Guild, right?
Correct. But most of the kind of literature that we produce is largely about techniques of printmaking. Even if you have a conversation today, it's largely about, I've made a print like this, I've used these many colors, this is the size of my work. It doesn't go beyond that, right? And so for me, it really was a transformative experience. And one of the things that actually happened in 1989 was that I joined Jamia Millia as an art history teacher. So I had finished my MFA in painting. I had come back from France. So Ramachandran ji and Paramjit Singh ji felt that art history needed to be taught by a painter. I was familiar with museum discourses. I was interested in art history. We had very little resources in Jamia Millia to teach art history, and I used to make students literally act out paintings just in order to understand what they were about. And I think they kind of liked my style of teaching art history, and so I got kind of continued there for about 11 years.
Could I interrupt you and just ask you to explain this? I'm interested. I'm an art history student. So what would you do?
So the thing is that art history was really taught by visiting galleries, acting out paintings, me reading out, excerpts from books, etc. And for me, it was a transformative experience because to learn to teach, I had to learn myself.
Correct, yes.
So art history in some sense came to me through that process. And we also had wonderful, people like Kavita Singh. Luckily for me that when I was in my MFA, Kavita, who was younger than me that time, had just joined Chandigarh, and she used to come to teach part-time to College of Art, and she opened up the world of art history to me in ways that nobody else had ever done before. And the sheer pleasure of looking at paintings and artworks in such an engaged way was fascinating. We had wonderful working and practicing teachers with us. We had, the 1980s in College of Art, we had people like Jaizaroteji, we had Anupam Sood, we had Ranveer Kalika. These were practicing artists. Right? So we were pretty conversant with what was happening in the world. We were going to see the exhibitions. We were, in the 90s as well, taking students to art galleries and making them aware of the broader art world was important. And that's really how I taught art history.
That's great. Okay, so back to, you were talking about how you get into one of your practices, your art practice. So would like to know more about it.
So I really became interested in issues of labor and caste, attitudes that shaped our view of the world that hadn't been discussed art historically for the longest time. As even if you look at as Santosh S from Ambedkar University has pointed out, if you look at all the art historians who were practicing art history, they did not mention the word caste even once in their writings and books.
Yeah.
Right? And this was so central to the discourse in JNU because the students were really questioning us from their lived experience about the kind of art histories we were teaching, right? And so the Pandita Ramabai exhibition that I did was really looking at this aspect of a woman. A lot of it came from my reading. I was reading Uma Chakravarti, I was reading a lot of Gauri Vishwanathan, for instance, and so this figure was a truly inspirational figure who had the capacity to question all forms of religious patriarchy. Whether it was Hindu, whether it was Christian, she was somebody who questioned religious patriarchy. Right? And for me, she became somebody who had the capacity to just question the status quo. And so that was the result of that. I also became interested in issues of, because she's somebody who experiences the death of her entire family. She's herself from a Brahmin family, but she marries a person who's a lawyer from Bengal. And if you believe in the caste system at all or want to talk about it, then somebody from a lower caste. And that kind of is a transformative experience for her because she also becomes a widow at a very young age, right? Her husband passes away, she's left with a daughter. And that widowhood or that experience of marginalization on account of widowhood, this is something that makes her question the system. And so for me, it was quite natural that I would actually look towards this subject. Later, I became interested in labor.
I just wanted to ask you about that exhibition. Some very interesting glass sculpture. The form of it was very intriguing in that particular exhibition. Could you explain what it meant? They looked like books opened and kept.
So for me, the book form is something that is a register of her capacity to read and question, right? So much of it is about questioning societal norms through reading. She's a scholar. And the capacity to read and think and articulate a different position became very important. And so, in fact, that whole series was around a lot of the book motif.
Correct, yes.
Right? And the printing press as well, which is also a kind of a motif that I use in one of, and the images of death.
Yes, those, the feet tied up.
Correct.
They were also taken on a print on glass or something.
Acrylic.
Yeah, acrylic. I find printmakers are very experimental when they print in some other kind of media. They do stretch themselves a little more. So I felt that there was some printmaker in you which made you do those printings on glass, is it? Or something like that?
I am a trained printmaker. That's my medium. And I didn't necessarily use printmaking as a form of reproduction.
But how you look at layers are very different. Then layering of works are very different from others, actually.
Correct.
Yeah. Correct. So then you were talking about labor. So this is also another of your inquiry. So
this actually really began on one of my visits to the National Gallery of Modern Art. And if you look at the sculpture, The Triumph of Labor, it's only male bodies. Right?
Right.
And so the nation, so you're talking about an institution that was set up in the 1950s, which marks the presence of the nation through the male laboring body.
Right.
And so that really made me set off a series of questions in my mind because I've recently written an article for the Map Museum thing where if you look at the initial sketches that were made by D.P. Roy Chowdhury, of the laboring figures, there are many women. Right? Their torso is bare because lower caste women were also not allowed to cover their upper torso, right? And we know, for example, from the kind of work that Professor Jha, for example, that road work, which is what that sculpture represents, building roads, most of the work was actually done by women, the stone breaking part. Removing the boulders may have been done by the men, but the actual breaking of the stones to make the roads that built India were done by women. So it's that absence of women's labor or its erasure is something that made me look at it more closely. Also because there's a lot of really interesting work that's been done by scholars like Anne McClintock, where she has talked about how domestic labor, which is what women do, is about cleaning floors and dusting chairs and polishing objects to multiply the reflective surfaces to increase your possessions through reflection. And women entered into the domestic space of work or got locked into the domestic space of work only with modernity. Otherwise, when work was a kind of a family production, women were part of
Part
that.
of it, part of the whole.
So now you have productive work by men being done in factories and offices outside the home. The domestic work is something that women don't get recognized for. So that led to me a series of kind of works questioning the idea of labor and this kind of abstraction or disappearance of labor. Right? We can talk of abstraction in many different ways.
Right.
Right? So what you're actually seeing is this kind of an etherization of women's labor into,
to thin air
Yeah.
and without.
So that, and then also because, I had friends from Mauritius, the whole experience of indentured labor, which is again something that we tend to pass over. We don't even study this in school
Could you
histories.
explain that?
So indentured labor is really another form of slavery, right? Which after slavery was abolished, vast number of Indians were taken, sometimes through unethical contracts. To work in sugar plantations across the world, whether it's South Africa, whether it's as far as the Caribbean, whether it's Mauritius, whether it is this thing. And most of these people were from non-land owning communities, so obviously from the lower strata of society, right? And so this vast migration that, was across the seas, this was something that we never looked at. And I happened to go to Mauritius, and most of them are sugar economies, right? They produce sugar. So something that sweetens our life is something that's been produced by the labor of indentured work. And this is something that I did many years ago. I mean, I know that as a theme, this is something that I explored, I think, maybe 15, 16 years ago, in 2008 or 9. And so
this is a societal topic that you were interested in. This is nothing. Is it anything to do with the art history, or it was generally one of your predominant field of inquiry?
So it became an artwork. It resulted in a whole series of works.
Okay.
That use sugar as a material, as a primary material, because sugar and sweat, they're both sticky and they're both this thing. And I actually did a lot of archival work for that project.
What was the name of the project?
So this was called Acts of Erasure.
Acts of Erasure. Okay.
Acts of Erasure. So this was really the result of looking at, again, in some sense, a kind of relationship between sugar and sweat, and both are liquid forms of, bodily material. One is bodily material, one is produced through agricultural labor.
But it's representing both extreme ends of the spectrum for what happened.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And yeah, so for me, some of the archival documents, and I'm really, again, my work has so much to do with what others have also been writing on. There's a wonderful scholar called Marina Carter, who's done some amazing work looking at petitions and writings at indentured labor that wanted to come back, but because the contracts were so unequal, she has archived that. And one of the letters described a plantation owner's acts of brutality, where he would coat the back of the indentured laborer with sugar syrup and then whip them so that the skin would come off.
Wow.
Talking about flaying here, right? And that really, in some sense triggered something in my mind, and that led to this really.
When was this?
I think 2008 or 9, you'll have to look at the dates.
Okay,
I don't remember exactly when.